Kasbah. We're very excited to be here and we're really happy to have you all with us. And secondly, we, as part of the Marrakech Biennale, we are delighted to welcome Richard Hamilton, who's joined us today. Richard has written a wonderful book, The Last Storytellers, which is Tales from the Heart of Morocco. Richard will tell us more about the storytelling tradition. After that, at the end, we do have some of his books here if anyone would like to purchase a signed copy and speak more to Richard later. After Richard has introduced the storytellers and read a couple of his own stories, we will hand over to one of the masters of the genre, Ahmed Azrani, who has been a storyteller all of his life, and he will be joined for the first time, we believe, ever, by young English-speaking Moroccan apprentices. They have been working with Ahmed for the last 6 weeks, so please give them a really wonderful applause.
Thank you all for being here, and I must say it's a real honour and a privilege to be here, because this is really what I've been crying out for years since I started researching the storytellers. I thought if only there was somewhere where storytellers could carry on their tradition and where the next generation could learn the trade as well. So this is really a dream come true. I mean, my book in some ways was rather negative because I was looking at the death of the tradition of storytelling. And you know, I was rather pessimistic because most of the storytellers were very old men. Since I wrote the book, I interviewed 5 of them, and 2 of them have sadly died. So, you know, in some ways, when I wrote the book, I wasn't that optimistic about the future of storytelling. But to come here and see the energy that Mike and Melissa and Malika and Osama and Ahmed Azrani are putting into this new project is very humbling. And it's just a fantastic opportunity. So I'm not going to talk too long, but I wanted to try and set the context of Moroccan storytelling and just explain why, you know, how old it is, why it's been around so long, what the enduring appeal of storytelling really is. And I'd like to start off, this might seem a bit weird, but in a rather left field way. In 1944, a couple of American psychologists did an extraordinary experiment. They showed a film, a black and white film in 1944 with some very simple shapes and objects on a screen. There was a couple of triangles, a couple of circles, some lines that were sort of a square but not quite, like one side of the square was a bit wonky, and they moved around, and they're basically random images on a screen. And they showed this as an experiment, a psychological experiment. They showed this to 115 people. And out of those 115, only 3 people reported seeing random objects. The rest of them said, oh well, it's a story about a prison warden, and he's let the triangle inside the cell, and then the circle is the other inmate of the prison, and it's wobbling around, and then they break through the door, you know. And that was one interpretation, and then someone else said, no, it's a shepherd, and he's trying to get his sheep into the pen. And basically all these people that saw this film made stories out of these random objects. And so this psychological experiment showed that the human brain naturally seeks out a narrative. I even found this afternoon. I was sitting in the Café de France overlooking the square, and I thought, oh, I wonder what that couple are doing. You know, is that his husband? Is that his girlfriend? Or, you know, when we see something, there's something in our brains that works out a story. And psychologists have tried to understand why storytelling is so important. And evolutionary theorists, I don't want to sound too academic about this, but when they've done research, they've looked into why humans tell stories. And one theory is that we get to rehearse things in real life. So it's like a virtual flight simulator. And for example, if you're training a pilot to land his plane on an aircraft carrier, you wouldn't say to him, look, I know you've never flown this plane before, but don't worry, you'll be flying it at 300 miles per hour, and you've got to land at that object down there, which looks like the size of a pin, and it's very rocky, and off you go, mate. Good luck, and just give it a go, because you've got nothing to lose. No, you don't do that. And what you do is you sit the pilot down in front of a screen, and he learns on a flight simulator. And in a way, psychologists and evolutionary social historians believe that this is why storytelling has evolved from primitive societies all the way up to now, thousands of years. It's one of the oldest forms of communication and entertainment. And it's because it's like children's play. You're learning to cope with real life situations. One writer that wrote a book called The Storytelling Animal had a lovely phrase. He said, you learn what it would be like to fight your enemy or seduce someone else's wife, but without having to suffer the consequences. So you're practicing. It's like dreams. They are a way of experimenting for situations that might turn up in real life. So this is, that's one theory about why we tell stories. And at the introduction to my book, I have a quote which is one of my favourites. I think I'll read it again. It says, "A need to tell and hear stories is essential to Homo sapiens. It's second in necessity after nourishment and before love and shelter. Millions survive without love or hope, almost none in silence." And I find that a very powerful quote, and that's by an American writer called Reynolds Price. And another American writer, a Native American Indian called Joseph Bruchac, he summed it up in a beautiful way in why storytelling is so powerful and so engaging, and why no modern form of media can replicate that intimacy between the storyteller and the audience. And he says, "A told story is alive. The story breathes with the teller's breath. The experience cannot be captured by any form of technology." So, without sort of talking too much, I'll just tell a very short story that's in my book. And it's not very long, and I'm sure we're going to be hearing great stories shortly. But this is one of my favourite ones, and I recorded it in the Jamar al-Fanar, in the main square here in Marrakech, with Abderrahim El-Makweri, who's one of the oldest storytellers. He's still alive. He came along here, and he's interested in the future and telling the stories here in Café Clock. So it's called The King and His Prime Minister. There was once a king who had a prime minister who was called It's Good. They gave him this name because no matter what the king said, the minister always remarked, "It's good." One day the Prime Minister met the king in the garden of his great palace, where he found him idly chopping a small strip of bamboo with his dagger. The dagger slipped on the bamboo, and the monarch sliced a piece of his finger off. "It's good," the Prime Minister exclaimed. The king wrapped a bandage around his finger, but he didn't think it was good at all. In fact, he was so angry that he ordered the politician to be locked up in prison and left there to rot. Some days later, the king wanted to get away from all his problems and the endless intrigue in the palace. He decided to make a voyage by sea, so he boarded a ship and sailed away. After many days, the vessel came to an island. When the king arrived at the island, he thought it was a beautiful place, and he disembarked alone. But no sooner had he left the boat than he met some natives who warned the king that on this island, strangers are always captured and sacrificed at dawn the next day. Before the king even had time to think about this, he saw a group of fierce-looking soldiers running towards him. They chased the king, caught him, and brought him to the high priest. Now, it was the tradition on this island that before they could kill anyone, the high priest would check if he would make a good sacrifice. So the soldiers took off the king's clothes to see whether anything was missing, because you cannot sacrifice a body which is not complete. When they brought the naked king to him, the high priest noticed that a part of his finger had been chopped off. And when the priest saw this, he said, "Stop! This man cannot be sacrificed. Give him his horse, his weapon, and let him go." So the king hurriedly went back to his ship and left. As he was sailing back, he began to think about the Prime Minister, who was still in jail, and he remembered what he'd said. The king thought to himself, "Oh, he was right after all. When he said it's good that I cut my finger, he knew what he was talking about. If I had not cut it, I would have been sacrificed. So when the king came home, he freed the Prime Minister and told him all about his ordeal on the island. He asked the Prime Minister, "How was your time in jail?" The Prime Minister said, "It's good." The king was amazed and said, "How can it have been good?" "Well, thank God you put me in prison," replied the Prime Minister. "If you'd taken me to the island with you, you would have escaped, but I would have been sacrificed." So I just read that story in a way because it illustrates lots of things about the Moroccan tradition of stories and storytelling. And what I like about it is that almost every time I read it, it has a different meaning. It has lots of different layers to it. They work for children, they work for adults, they work for everyone. And my initial impression was that it was a funny story, which, you know, I enjoyed because it was humorous. And then I realized that there was a moral, a message underneath it, which was saying it's okay to be imperfect. You know, the king who was missing a bit of finger, that imperfection saved his life. So there is a moral. It's like sort of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. You know, there was the imperfection was a good thing. And the other the message about it is that it shows you that there's this sort of Moroccan sense that, inshallah, everything will work out for the best. So I think that's a very profound message. Although it's an entertaining story that works for children, you know, as like a little gem that you hold up to the light, it can take on different meanings. And I find it sort of profoundly reassuring in a way, that message that we don't know what's going to happen in our lives. There's a phrase in Morocco, nothing is certain but everything is possible. And that simple story reveals that we don't know what's going on, but things normally work out for the best. And that's a very sort of good message to have, and, you know, particularly if you're, you know, even getting this cafe going. I'm sure it's had its ups and downs, but I'm sure that things will work out for the best. And then the other thing that occurred to me is that a lot of stories have a comic figure. And in the stories from Central Asia, from Afghanistan, there's a character called Nasruddin. And he is a sort of wise fool who goes through, he says silly things, but they are profoundly wise. So he is a sort of, this figure, the Prime Minister, is almost like Nasruddin. He's the wise figure, the wise fool. And I came across this wonderful quote from an Afghan poet, which could have been written about this story. And he says, this is the Afghan poet Rumi, who's a Sufi poet. He says, "From the point of view of man, a thing may appear to be good or evil, but from the point of view of God, everything is good." So, as I say, this story, although it feels quite silly, you know, I think in many ways it's very profound. And people have come up to me, almost every time I read it. Someone recently came up to me and said, I've heard that story in Buddhist thought. Because again, it's that sort of, we don't know what's going to happen, but God does. And then other people said, my rabbi told that to me. You know, so there's a Jewish tradition. And so really these stories migrate across cultures, you know, and that is why they're so universal and so appealing. And they appeal to people from different faiths. And I won't take up too much more of your time, but I've got another very short reading, which again is one of my favourites. I'll just get it up on here. Excuse the iPad. It's just easier to find things. Yeah. So this one's called "The Birth of the Sahara," and it was told to me by an old storyteller who's sadly not around anymore, Ahmed Timaisha. And he lived in the Mela, the Jewish quarter here in Marrakech. And he told me this story. It's called "The Birth of the Sahara." A long time ago, when the earth was very young, it was one huge garden covered in tall palm trees, jasmine, and the songs of nightingales flooded the landscape with their songs. At this time, all men were loyal, trustworthy, and honest. In fact, the word lie did not even exist. But one day, someone told a lie. It was a very small lie and of no importance. but it was the end of man's childhood and the age of innocence. So God summoned all the men on the earth together and said to them, "Each time one of you lies, I shall throw a grain of sand onto the earth." The men looked at each other, shrugged their shoulders, and said to themselves, "A grain of sand? What difference will that make? You can hardly see a grain of sand." And so, lie after lie, little by little, the Sahara gradually came into existence, as God threw grains of sand onto the earth from the heavens above. But here and there, the odd oases can still be seen, because these are the traces of the original garden, because not all men lie. So that again is a very simple, but I think very profound story, and I always feel sort of quite emotional about it. I don't know why, I always get a bit of a lump in my throat coming to the end of it. And one of the other storytellers I interviewed, he came up with a lovely phrase. I said, "Why do you like storytelling?" And he said, "Well, before technology, this is all we had." And really it's the oldest form of communication, the oldest form of entertainment. And I feel sort of quite passionately that with modern technology, we are losing that intimate communication, you know. And another quote that I came across, I was reading a copy of The Big Issue in London, and this guy said Karl Marx predicted that the next big battle of humanity would be alienation. And I thought, in a way, our cleverness and our technology is alienating us. I go to cafes in London, and the cafes are silent because everybody's you know, on their laptop or their iPad or their iPhone. And the whole point of a cafe was that it was a talking shop for discussions, you know. And I find it very sad that although our communication skills have increased exponentially, ironically we're losing that human interaction, you know. So what I think is really exciting about a place like this is that it's somewhere to sort of reclaim our humanity amidst all this madness of modern technology, which is actually alienating people. I think there's nothing more beautiful than a storyteller telling, you know, that the message goes from his mouth into the ears of the audience. It's the most simple process, and yet one of the most profound things that mankind has ever done. You know, I can't sort of overstate how important I think storytelling is. And I heard an interview with an opera singer many years ago on the radio, and she said that the human voice is the most complex and beautiful musical instrument in the world, and it cannot be replicated. So again, that process of the storyteller telling a story and people listening is something, you know, very precious, and I'm just so proud that this is a place where that storytelling tradition can come alive again. And I really feel that, you know, this is a revival. And there's another saying in Marrakech, because as I said, two of the storytellers that I interviewed have since passed away, and there's a storytelling tale that says, when a storyteller dies, the library burns. Because most of these oral narratives are in the heads of the storyteller. They've not been written down. So you are losing this great treasury, this great repository, this library of knowledge every time a storyteller dies. And I really think it's to do with, you know, the reason why the crowds are not in the Jamar al-Fanar anymore is because young people have got more immediate forms of communication. They've got internet, they've got movies, they've got Facebook. You know, so they're not drawn to that public spectacle anymore. And this actually happened in Ireland. Ireland was one of the last places in Europe, and like Morocco, it's on the western edge of the continent. And in Ireland, they have a lovely saying: when electricity came, the fairies flew out of the window. And I find that that sums it up to me, really. So I'll just finish by saying, because people say, how old are these stories? Well, the records from a Moroccan historian, they go back to 1650. There were people still telling stories in Jamar al-Fanar. But people think the stories may be as old as the founding of the city itself in the 11th century. and possibly older because the Berber tradition goes back before the Arab conquest of North Africa, so before the 7th century. So we're talking before even the 1001 Nights in the 9th century, so this is a very old tradition. And what's so rich about these stories is that they're this wonderful blend of stories from the Middle East, stories from sub-Saharan Africa, stories from the Berber tradition. And really, I can't sort of stress, how much I love Marrakech and how much I love the stories, and they've helped me to understand what can be quite an unfathomable place. They've helped me to get underneath the skin of Morocco. I mean, I'm not an Arab speaker, I worked with a translator. I find Morocco a confusing place, And King Hassan once said, the more you know about Morocco, the less you understand. And I feel like that myself. But, the stories are a way into society. And I did send a copy of my book to King Mohammed VI, and I didn't expect to get a reply, but I did, and I'm very honoured. He said, "Dear Mr. Hamilton, thank you so much for sending me a copy of your inspiring book, The Last Storytellers, which brilliantly illustrates an ancient oral tradition in my country. This book shows again your keen interest in Morocco and Moroccan culture. I cannot but commend your untiring, meticulous work, building on stories gathered directly from some of our most renowned storytellers. You have introduced readers to a time-honoured Moroccan tradition. It's a fitting tribute that your publication should prove to be so popular, especially with scholars and visitors to the Jamar al-Fanar Square, which was proclaimed part of UNESCO's World Intangible Heritage. I wish you continued success in all you achieve." So I'm very honoured, but I think the people that he's really commending are the master storytellers, and I would now like to hand over to Ahmed Azrani and some of our young apprentices. So, and there'll be an opportunity to buy copies of my book if you like. But as I say, it's a great honour for me to be here, and I'm just so delighted that this place is perhaps going to be the future of storytelling, a real hub of this oral tradition. So thank you very much.
Before Hajj starts, if you can just give me 2 minutes while we make the milkshakes we need for upstairs, and then we'll be right back with the installment. Thank you.